You know, when there weren't movies and stuff, it was probably much easier to get. And you know,
the movies back then were all comedies. They weren't scary at all.
Just Charlie Chaplin everywhere.
I hope we don't get emails about that. So I heard a rumor. Is this based on a dream that she had? Is that true?
So it's actually quite an interesting story about how the whole thing got written. So she was off with like a crew of, I think it was like her. He wasn't quite her husband at that point or something, but like they were, you know, it was like her partner and then 2 other guys, and the 4 of them were sort of traveling around Europe. And this is like back in the day when like the rich people would have castles in a couple of different countries and stuff.
Of course.
So they're in Switzerland or something. And basically, it was just like the weather was just really crap for a few weeks, so they couldn't really go outside and do anything. And they were all sort of authors and that type of thing. So they decided to have a competition over a few weeks that they were sort of stuck in this cabin because of the weather. And so it was like, who could write the scariest horror story? And so she couldn't really come up with any ideas, but they're often talking because the big thing in Frankenstein is this concept of galvanization. It was recently after electricity had been discovered, so there was this idea that. And they found out electricity would stimulate muscles.
Yeah.
So there was this idea that you could electrocute someone back to life. And they were talking a lot about that in the cabin. And so one night, Mary Shelley had a dream of this doctor who had brought a corpse back to life. And, you know, the dream terrified her. So she came up with the whole concept of this book, wrote it out in a few weeks. And
Did she win the competition?
I think she did. And it got published.
Were there any other stories that came out of this?
I don't know of any of the others.
Okay.
I don't know if the others.
Maybe they were all really shitty authors.
But obviously, because she was a woman, they had to publish it anonymously at first. It wasn't until it became very popular that she actually got to put her name on it. So at first it was just like Frankenstein, and I think it was like that husband guy. I think his name was Percy Shelley or something. He was the one who actually had to take it to
like the publishers
and stuff. But so she sort of just wrote it in a cabin for a competition, and now it's right up there in one of the most famous works of literature of all time.
What was that book that was written, that like young adult book that was written by a kid? There was this kid that wrote like a young adult book and it became really popular, and it was because he entered it into a competition. So he's like the Mary Shelley of our day.
50 Shades of Grey?
That wasn't it. That was a fan fiction. That was a Frankenstein fan fiction, 50 Shades of Green. Where he shows off his bolt collection.
Yeah, so there's none of that in this. That's a movie.
That's just movies.
That's a movie.
Probably
concept.
all comes from like the Universal movies.
Yeah. So I mean, it's quite an interesting story, sort of how it got put together, and it's quite an interesting book. Like I said, it sort of explores that concept of humanity's role, like on Earth. Like, when are we going too far? Especially like, you know, if you felt this way back then, you can imagine. But it's quite an interesting read. I quite like these old school, this style of the letter writing. I don't know what it is that appeals to me about it, but like I really enjoyed reading Dracula, this, and the Sherlock Holmes books. I quite like that style where it's like somebody recounting it.
Correspondence stories. Is that the word for it? Or did I just
probably not.
I mean, it sounds correct.
It could be.
So are these themes of like science going too far and stuff? Are they just through the book, or are they things that Mary Shelley really kind of felt?
I'm not too familiar with the rest of her life.
Did she ever? What happened to her after this book? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to look it up.
Didn't do your research, bro.
I'll talk about it in 2 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, you got 2 weeks to find out, to track her down. We can do a Where Are They Now on Mary Shelley.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, she was obviously pretty terrified about all this stuff to put it in this book. I think she was 16 or 18 when she wrote it.
Jeez.
So,
yeah. I'm 4 years overdue for my Frankenstein. Anyway.
Better get writing.
Maybe this podcast is my Frankenstein, huh? Huh?
No.
Alright, see you in 2 weeks. Is there anything else you want to say about it?
No, I think that's everything. I'll just let you get into it.
2 weeks. See ya.
See ya.
And we're live. So, before we get to Frankenstein...
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say I did like it.
Okay.
There's obviously a reason that it has stood the test of time.
Yeah. But I think I tried to pick one because, like, with a lot of these old works, they exist and they're still famous because of like their contextual importance.
Yeah.
But this is one that I actually feel is still a good read.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of the other ones is, you know, like for instance, I read The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I get why that has had an important impact on like lots of literature since then. But like, I did not enjoy reading it.
Yeah. It had cultural significance, but you didn't enjoy it as much.
Exactly. So I thought Frankenstein fit both criteria. I thought it was still good.
I think that's a good segue for me to open up with what I want to talk about, which is Star Wars. And we might alienate some of our listeners here.
So that was actually the other example I was thinking of in my head.
Yes.
But I was like, I think Reuben and I are the only two people in the world who feel this way.
Yeah, we should explain we're not fans of the original Star Wars. 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah. I mean, they're not bad.
They're not bad, and they're definitely culturally important, but it just feels like maybe it's a bit of a Seinfeld is unoriginal kind of trope where it did so many things that were so inspired that were copied later.
Yeah.
And in more modern ways. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, this is exactly how I feel about the original Star Wars movies. It's like, I get why they were so big for people who were around when they came out, and like they've changed so much. Yeah. But as somebody who was born in the 90s, I was too late to really get them,
to really appreciate
that
them.
much out of them. And like, you know, now that Star Wars Episode 7 came out last year, I thought that was far and away the best
Star Wars.
And like, I felt like that was what the originals, it was very much captured the spirit of the originals, but put them in all of the great sort of CGI and acting
things that we have now. Yeah.
And I thought that improved the experience.
And I mean, it wasn't revolutionary, obviously, in the same way, because it was a derivative of the first 3 movies. But anyway, enough about Star Wars. The reason I want to talk about that is because that's kind of how I felt with Frankenstein.
Okay.
Although I did like it, I did enjoy reading it a lot more than watching Star Wars. What I mean is, it clearly, it's a very well written book and it's clearly very well done, but there are a lot of points where it's like, this is something that makes sense for the time, but doesn't translate that well.
Sure.
And one example I would point to is, it's obviously written in the language style of the time. It's very verbose and very flowery language, even to the point where Frankenstein's monster is very eloquent and well-spoken. So Victor Frankenstein's this dude. He likes science. He goes off and studies for a while, and then he becomes obsessed with... And in the book, it's kind of referred to as this mystery thing that he discovers. It's never explicitly stated that it's electricity, but he just says, I figured out something. And then he uses that unnamed something to bring back a body to life. Yeah. Which takes about just like a paragraph in the book. It's very glossed over, the main defining event of this story. But
well, she was a writer, not a scientist, so she probably thought it was best just to skip straight to it.
Yeah, and then after that, he is kind of depressed by what he's done because he realizes this is such an abhorrent thing, and he flees and loses contact with the monster. It vanishes, and then later on, he's returning back to his home, and his younger brother is killed, and he figures out that it was the monster. And their housekeeper is kind of sentenced to death because of that. They think that she is the one who did it. And basically this monster follows him around and kills a couple of people, core people in his life, his adopted sister / fiance. Yeah. And his best friend and his younger brother. And then eventually we kind of have this moment where the monster's recounting his side of the story, and he tells about how everyone was already really prejudiced against him, and he went and learned English from living with this foreign family, and yet somehow he is very eloquent and speaks with a very, very well-known, Anyway, and then there's this kind of conflict, and then the whole story is being told in flashbacks from Frankenstein, who's now chasing this monster through the Arctic. Yeah. Anyway, there's a summary of this public domain book. Yeah, so there are a lot of things in that story which really feel dated, like Frankenstein's language. Yeah.
I mean, I guess an interesting comparison, I think I brought it up in the first half, was I talked briefly about like Sherlock as another example of something that was written. It was John Watson's journals. And then if you look at that modern Sherlock show with Martin Freeman and Benedict Cumberbatch, it's like they did a very good job in the first 2 seasons of taking the old Sherlock stories and putting them into the modern world. apart from Hound of the Baskervilles, which they butchered.
Yeah, turned into weird gas.
But particularly like some of the earlier episodes, they took like, you know, it was a horse cart driver and he was a cab driver.
A cabbie, yeah.
And so they did good changes like that, and I think that was part of that series' success, is that it contained enough of the spirit of the originals that like old cranky fans loved it, but it was modern enough that everyone else can enjoy it. Yeah,
and obviously this is the original, so it's kind of, in some ways it's a bit unfair to judge it on that standard, but I still have to do that because I'm not reading it at the time. Another thing that comes up is, at the start of the book, Frankenstein is talking to this captain who finds him in the Arctic, and telling him about his life story, and it's very hinted that there's a lot of like messed up stuff that is happening in his life. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding that in the first, I'd say, third of the book, when Frankenstein is recounting like how he was growing up and when he went off to study at this boarding school or college, I think. Yeah. And a lot of the mystery is really it feels like the mystery is supposed to carry you through that, because it's a lot of backstory heavy. But because obviously I already know exactly what's going to happen to a lot of degrees, it does feel like it falls flat in that way because I already know what's going to happen.
Sure.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's hard because I have to try and put myself in the mindset of what would it be like if I had never heard of this story or any of the subsequent stories about it, you know?
I'm not sure, because I think even then, I mean, the elevator pitch for the book, even back then, if you were somebody who'd read it in the 17th century, and then you're trying to sort of say, this is what it's about.
The elevator pitch. What's the equivalent of the elevator pitch?
I mean, it'd be like a doctor brings a dead body back to life and, you know, things go wrong.
But it's the thing that I liked about it is a lot of the major points from later adaptations, which I was expecting to be such a huge part of the book, really weren't. Like, actually bringing the body back to life is not important in the book, really. It's just about what happens after.
In the movies, that's like the big scene.
That's the goal of the movie.
Yeah. And I mean, you say the same thing. So like going back to another book like Dracula, he's actually like sunlight is fine in Dracula. It was the movie Nosferatu that added the element that it killed them. I think sunlight weakened vampires in Dracula, but it never killed them.
Yeah. And so I guess there were still a couple of really nice surprises reading through this book. I mean, I didn't know the full extent of Frankenstein's story and how he learned English by watching this family through the cracks. Frankenstein's monster, sorry. And there's this scene where he finally is willing to introduce himself to this family that he calls his protectors, that he has kind of watched for ages. And what he decides to do that is their grandfather is blind, and so he hopes that if he meets the grandfather first, he'll be able to kind of introduce himself and get to know the grandfather, and then that will carry him through.
Yeah.
And it's a good plan, right? But it fails because the rest of the family comes home quick first and everything starts going to hell.
Yeah, they freak out.
Yeah, and you really feel for him. Even though he's killed people, he kind of tells his side of the story and do really feel for him.
And I think it's sort of, you're meant to get the impression that like when he's killed people, it's either sort of been an accident because they've been like freaking out about him, or, you know, it's because he's like in a mad rage, which again, like he sort of feels that it's Victor's fault
for this.
Because, you know, he never really had a parent or anything. Like he was just abandoned by Victor. So of course he didn't learn any better.
And he was kind of born with the level of knowledge of a baby, right?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't know what's going on at the start. He just kind of knows that people are attacking him and he's freaking out. And he kind of does pretty well considering that he's raised in such a dog-eat-dog kind of way.
I guess part of it, like, going back to what you're saying, that he was so eloquent. I mean, if you're thinking about it, this is all being recounted by Victor, so he could be paraphrasing.
He could be paraphrasing, that's true.
The monster might have been less eloquent.
Could be more like me, Frankenstein.
Yeah.
It's not... It's classed as like a gothic horror book, right? Yeah. But really, it's more of a... I mean, horror doesn't really come into it.
It's not relevant anymore, I think, to call this a horror book.
It's hard to say whether it once was a horror book, but there definitely are elements of... Frankenstein's monster is like a tragic villain in this.
Yeah.
In the story. And it just kind of feels like Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster both have these fucked up lives now. It's a very kind of like, their lives are so intertwined in such a way that like, they're both really fucked up and they'll never really be free of this. Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's a scary book at all. I'd say it's more sad. I mean, there are scenes where you really feel for Frankenstein and you really feel for Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, nobody's a winner in this book.
Yes, there are no winners. There are only dead people and Frankenstein and his monster. I feel like that we need it's probably too late now, but we needed to establish like a name, like FM, we can call him. Frankie. So there's Victor and Frankie. And yeah, it just kind of feels sad. I can't.
So I'm trying to remember. I think in high school when I wrote about this, we were told to call him the monster.
The monster, yeah, because he's never called Frankenstein's monster in the book. Obviously, he's referred to as like the monster or the abomination or whatever. Yeah, it's a sad book. It's a sad book, but it is, even though there are things which didn't hold up as well as they would have. As well as they were intended in the day, it's still definitely a good read. I think overall it's still, fun. And it's still earned its place. It's definitely earned its place as a cornerstone of literature. Yeah. So yeah, what would I give it? On my out of 10s, I guess I'd give it... I'm wary of giving everything that we do a 7. But I'd say, this one... Yeah, I'd say maybe an 8.
You may as well start using a scale of 7 to 8.
Where on the 7 to 8 scale would I give it? No, I mean, that's a problem, is it is worth recommending, but it still has its flaws. Yeah. And if you can find someone like me who has lived under a rock long enough to not have actually read the original Frankenstein... I was talking to people that I know, and it seems like everyone has read this, whether for like 12 English or,
I think, that was part of why I thought it was good for this podcast. It was a piece of media you had
I had so inexplicably missed. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. I really liked it. It was good.
Cool.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Media MD.
Getting your vampire accent on.
Getting ready for my vampire accent, because next week we will be talking about Salem's Lot. Have you ever heard that small towns are the lifeblood of America? Because vampires drink blood, so maybe that's a joke.
How do I stop the recording?
of America. Because vampires drink blood, so maybe that's a joke.
How do I stop the recording?
Of America. Because vampires drink blood, so maybe that's a joke.
How do I